I'm a bit biased because I am one of Silvia's supervisors, but I'm really pleased to see her at this stage of being able to present her research to the school. Obviously, it's work in progress. But just by way of introduction, Silvia is a postgraduate student in the School of Social Work and Social Policy. She's co-supervised with Gabriela Bors in the School of Politics. Her doctoral research focuses on young people, political and civic activists in the UK. And I think it's been said that we live in very turbulent times. So there's no better time, I think, to look at young people's motivations and political engagement, activists, and what drives young people to get involved in these things. So in terms of Silvia's research and timing it with a post-Brexit, post-COVID, and everything else that's going on, this has been fortunate. And she's done tremendously well to recruit over 1,000 people for her project at a time where we know how hard it is to get people to take part in research and so on. So I'm very excited to introduce Silvia. We'll do what we usually do, that Silvia will talk for about half an hour, and then we'll open the floor for questions and comments. Obviously, we have the chat function. People can type comments. I wonder if to keep the chat until later on, so it's not distracting her while she's speaking. But that's all I'll say. Silvia, do you want people to say their names, or do you know everyone who's here?
I think it's quite a big group, so maybe going through it might take a while. So
Okay,
I'd rather,
so you want to
just,
yeah, I think you know most people, but then I'll ask people to introduce themselves when they ask questions, if that's okay.
That's
Okay, so
fine.
if you're ready, then over to you. And thank you again for offering to entertain us at lunchtime. So go.
Thank you very much, Daniela. And also thank you to Gillian, who invited me to speak as part of the Social Work and Social Policy seminar series. I'll just start sharing my screen now. And one
Sorry,
moment,
just to
I always
say that we are
to...
recording this, so anyone who doesn't want to be on camera, although recording the screen, but just to let everyone know that's on.
And I know that you, there we go. Can you now only see my presentation?
Yes.
Yes, okay, perfect. Just checking, because otherwise it has like a strange presentation view here. Yes, very welcome everyone to my presentation today on my PhD research titled Young People's Activism, Themes, Motivations and Structures of Youth Civic and Political Participation in the UK. It's quite a mouthful. And I just want to very briefly talk about my research, what it is all about, and then I sort of like focus down on a specific aspect of it, because I think 30 minutes just don't have enough, with 30 minutes I just don't have enough time to focus on everything. But I'm happy to take questions beyond what I'll be talking about in this presentation, and also happy maybe later to talk about how data collection went, especially in times of COVID. But just very briefly, what do I look into? My project is a cross-section and mixed method project on young people's activism. So that includes civic and political participation, and what that exactly means I'll be talking about later. I look at young people who are 16 to 24-year-old. I think it's important to sort of like think about who is actually young, or who is at least defined as young in the context of my research. And my main leading research questions really are: which cognitive and social factors influence young people's activism in the UK? And also, which emotions and identities do young people associate with their activism? My project draws on social cognitive theory and integrative theory of participation research, and most specifically on the do-it-ourselves politics concept by Sarah Pickett, which I'll be explaining more in the next slide. And then my methods, as I said, it's a mixed methods project. So I had an online survey with more than 1,000 respondents, and I followed that up with 8 subsequent focus groups that were a bit smaller than I initially intended, but because I put them online, I think this actually worked quite well. So what I want to focus on today is the role of perception of agency. And what I mean with agency in the context of my study is sort of like the attribution of responsibility and to a certain extent also capability. So there can be personal agency, people who assume personally or as an individual responsibility, or who attribute this responsibility to oneself. There could be collective agency, so the attribution of responsibility and therefore capability to a group. This group might be quite abstract, such as society. Group might be quite specific, such as like a local community or local group. And then last but not least, institutional agency, the attribution of responsibility to institutions. In my context here, I mainly talk about political institutions, such as, for example, parliament, but this could also be expanded towards other actors in society, for example, economic actors. But stepping a step back, looking at the literature, where are we at here? So youth activism has generally been coined in recent times as a response to failing systems. And maybe if we think about what makes it so interesting actually to look at young people's participation, well, youth and young adulthood are a time of transition, not just from things such as like childhood to young adulthood, or in terms of education to the job market then, but also in terms of finding one's political interest. So it has been found as one of the most formative times for political interest, and to some degree this also determines participatory behavior. So I already said youth activism has been coined as a response to failing systems, and these systems might be political, but it might also be economic. And it's kind of this dissatisfaction with these systems that are failing, or at least the perception is that these systems are failing young people, or maybe bigger groups in specific, that young people feel the need to express their dissatisfaction and this response then enacts in activism. And ever since like the early 2000s, really, there has been a shift towards cause-orientated action. So we see less of membership-based or trade union actions. So it's not against trade unions as a membership-based organizations per se, but we just see this trend that younger people tend to be less organized in these groups. They're more likely to organize themselves via loose networks. Digital communication has obviously accelerated a lot of the ad hoc self-organization, mainly among young people, but also increasingly among other age groups as well. And in this sort of like thing about self-organization of young people, Sarah Pickett has coined the term of do-it-ourselves politics, which really is like a theoretical concept to synthesize what I just talked about. So this sort of like cause-orientated action, loose networks, sort of like very spontaneous sort of like protest reactions or responses to dissatisfaction. And what this concept says is that there is a differentiation between electoral and non-electoral forms of participation. Now that is not that new, because like things in terms of political participation have always been a bit distinguished between, like, say, the unconventional and the more conventional, and also what falls into each of these categories has varied over time. But just so you know, so electoral is more in this instance, electoral activities refer to things such as voting or any other activity that is more strongly aligned with political institutions or political parties, such as like donating to a party, campaigning for a party. Whereas non-electoral forms of participation are things that are not bound to parties or the party or the electoral system in particular. So there can also be things such as engaging with content online. There can be more civic things such as volunteering, especially if it's more for like a local community or maybe a political cause. There can be things such as signing a petition. And I'll show you like a range of activities that fall under this category later. Then this concept of do-it-ourselves politics of young people differentiates also between individual and collective dimensions of participation. This is interesting later when we actually look at the factors and see maybe there's some differences between what influencers see. So maybe they're differently motivated. I already sort of like touched upon this. Participation is not bound to a party ideology, or a lot of young people's participation is not bound to party ideology or formalized structures. And this is what I'll be going into with my data in my next slides. Do it ourselves politics, so young people coming together, organizing themselves, are characterized by a high level of self-reliance and agency, because the young people actually, as Pickett writes, take it into their own hands to try and strive for political and social change. And with that, I would like to just very briefly talk about my data collection. So I started off with my first phase, an online survey in early 2021. Now I think it's important to mention this to contextualize that we were still in like winter lockdown at the time. And I think that also is reflected in some of the free text comments I got in the survey. I was lucky to get a sample size of 1094. The data set I'm presenting today is weighted. So I just let you know what kind of like the general socio and demographic variables are. So we have about like a correct distribution across the 4 nations. And maybe just to very briefly talk about the weighting process. What the weighting process did was to kind of increase the older age group in the sample, so it's the 20 to 24-year-olds. And also I had a surplus of female respondents. So that means that male respondents, their answers like way more in the survey now, in the weighted set. I can talk about it at length, but I want to just move on just so you know, some of the things are like, well, in comparison to the unweighted data set, are a bit different, but the general tendencies still remain. And I think this is important to know. Then phase 2 were semi-structured interviews with focus groups. Those happened some months later in May, June of 2021. So I had 30 participants overall in 8 focus groups. Again, those were 16 to 24-year-olds with residents in the UK. Those people were recruited via the survey. So it was actually quite nice that they already knew, okay, I have participated in the survey, I wanted to contribute more. And by and large, these were more active people that were really interested and passionate. And I made the decision to organize the focus groups around 3 thematic clusters, because in my approach, I found it like easier for people to find a common theme to then talk about, but I left it open to the participants to then take these themes into any direction they wanted to. And these themes were not just arbitrarily, like I didn't just came up with them randomly, but I looked into what the survey respondents had actually said. And this is what I'll be talking about in just a moment. But just so you know, I think I had 3 groups on environment and climate change, then another 3 groups on anti-racism, activism, and the Black Lives Matter movement, which also talked a lot about just general discrimination and inequality, and then 2 groups on feminism, LGBTQ rights. Okay, so data, which is the most interesting bit here. So we start off with young people's issues of concern. And so in the survey, I asked young people how worried they are about a certain set of items, really. And in these, or these items could be rated then from like 1, well, I don't really worry about it, to like 10, like I worry about it quite a lot. And when we rank the mean scores of these worry scores, as we call them, you can see that climate change came out on top. And it was actually quite interesting because it was among all subgroups, whether it was male respondents, female respondents, the age groups, it was always coming out on top with different levels, sort of like female respondents in both the unweighted and the weighted data set seem to be more concerned about it. Also young people, or the younger age group of the 16 to 19-year-olds seem to be more concerned about it, but it was persistently number 1 of concerns among this specific list of items. That's also important to know. And then the following items were mostly related, I would say, to like an individual level, maybe with the exception of poverty in general, but COVID-19, financial insecurity and unemployment, so things that are things that can affect young people very easily, whereas the more also very important topics, but maybe more abstract topics of crime and violence, conflict and war, globalization, immigration, were less worried about by and large. And now I just have to move this a bit. So there we go. I also asked people to use the comment box to add any sort of like additional comments they had on their concerns. And it's a bit tricky here because I don't really want to quantify the qualitative, but there was a general trend in these comments. You see here word cloud generated from the 300 most frequent words in these free text comments, and rights and anything relating to personal rights or maybe group rights was very strong in these comments. So things like inequality, the issue of racism came up a lot, and I think people were definitely influenced or like having in mind the Black Lives Matter protests from the summer before, but also things such as transphobia, homophobia, and to a lesser extent, but still quite strong issues or worries about mental health, both general but also on a personal level. Now, the reason why you don't really see environment or climate change in this cloud is because this question, or like this comment box, just came after these 10 items I just showed you. And it's just mainly to sort of like reflect a little bit what else is out there, because obviously it was like an exhaustive list I gave young people. And this is also the reason why I then sort of like shaped the focus groups on like, okay, climate change is obviously very strong, but then people also worry a lot about these personal rights relating to sexuality, gender identity, ethnicity, or maybe other groups and characteristics. Going from the issues of concern to perception of agency. So I talked about agency as like an attribution of responsibility. I asked the respondents in the survey, well, who do you think needs to or can do something about these social and political issues? And I asked them, do you think individuals can do something about them? And it was quite interesting because we had pretty much a split between those people agreeing and those people disagreeing. Maybe this form of presentation isn't the most obvious to see, but you can sort of like see that about a third, a bit more than a third, agreed or strongly agreed that yes, individuals can do something about social and political issues, whereas about the other third disagreed, and then the rest sort of like split between, well, I neither agree nor disagree, or they didn't know or didn't give an answer. The picture looks quite different if we ask people or if I ask people about what they thought about people as a group. So here you can clearly see that it was 83% in total. So the vast majority of people said, yes, people as a group can do something about political and social issues. And then we have an even clearer picture when we asked people about politicians and the government. Well, basically 2/3 said, yes, obviously, politicians and the government can do something about this. And like, it was a very strong picture on like the perception of the responsibility of institutions. And this is kind of just confirmed when asked about the actors of agencies, or I asked young people as well, who do you think needs to assume responsibility to address these issues? And again, we have like a very clear stance that it's the UK government and politicians in general. And then we have the group people living in Britain, and only then we have individuals like me, like the respondents. The only thing I haven't been able to quite make sense of in this chart is the organizations and pressure groups, because I think my my initial reaction would to sort of like put it more in the collective agency sphere. But I guess if it's sort of like approached from like an individual perspective, it could be seen as more like an individual action in that regard. And I talked about non-electoral actions before. I asked in the survey the respondents, well, which actions have you done out of a set list of 9 activities? I also asked them, well, which of these have you done since the beginning of 2019, simply because 2020 wasn't a very representative year of any participation, I suppose. And you can clearly see here that it's things such as engaging with content online, signing a petition, but also going into political consumerism. Those were the things that young people mostly did. And when we differentiate here between the individual and the collective actions, you can clearly see, maybe with the exception of becoming a vegetarian or vegan, that it is mostly concentrated on the individual actions. I don't really have like complete answers to like, well, why does it concentrate on that? One idea is, of course, that it's more low barrier, it's easier to do, it's less commitment. You also have just a lot more opportunity to do so. Because if you live like in a small town somewhere in the countryside, you might not be able to go to a protest march on a regular basis. But another factor I think just to consider in this realm is that there was the COVID-19 pandemic, and that probably might have affected sort of like the skew towards the more individual activities. Now, bringing it together, the perception of agency and these different levels of participation. I do have some regression models, but I don't want to like pull them out all today because I have another half of my presentation focused on the focus groups. I just wanted to point out that there are some differences, namely when we look here at sort of like different activity levels of the respondents, and I differentiate here between low, medium, and high activity. And just so you know, the zero activity people are grayed out here because they often also didn't respond on the agency questions. Therefore, these means don't really represent something. But when we look at the means of agency of these different groups, we can see an upwards trend. Now, it's important to know that personal agency or all agency scores here go up from 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest, saying 5 is like, yes, individual can do something, or yes, groups can do something. And I have these nice little arrows here. The increase is not very high, but it is incremental. And this is also what comes out in the modeling I've been doing so far, that this perception of agency might not have a large causal effect, but it definitely has an incremental effect on the level of activity, meaning that people who do participate, especially in these more collectively shaped activities, have a stronger perception of collective agency, or literally of all agency scores, really. And then in the regression models, I feel a bit bad for not actually showing them today. There is the indication that personal agency is more strongly linked to collective activities, whereas collective agency is more strongly linked to individual activities, which I found quite interesting, I would say, but I have to do more sort of like data analysis to really make a robust link there, and also to come up with a assumption or explanation for that. However, though, changing a little bit the perspective now, I would like to just briefly talk about what people in the focus groups had to say about agency and how they perceive agency in their own role, maybe in their activism. And the focus groups were all mostly young people that were quite active, as you could already see in the survey respondents' answers. The sample was already geared towards the more active people. So maybe they have something like to say how they actually perceive their own role in their activism. And I start off with a quote from Frankie, and they said in one of the anti-racism groups, I believe, I know that younger me would have wanted to have someone out there to be able to make a change, or at least seem like they're making a change. But also part of me is just like, it's not my responsibility and there's only so much I can do. And that's what's difficult. I would be betraying myself by not getting involved, but also by getting involved, I'm putting all this extra strain on myself. So personal agency in the focus groups, by and large, were perceived as an empowerment and something that's positive, like actually getting involved is more positively coined than not getting involved, but at the same time also as a burden. And there was this duality, really, that it is a responsibility and people almost feeling this need to do something, but at the same time feeling quite overwhelmed by it. And it also depended from person to person here, but it was generally more ambivalent. Especially in the context of environmental activism, people called out that there has been almost like an unnecessary emphasis on individual actions, not just by people, but especially by political actors. And a lot of people who are more in the realm of like identity-based activism, so people who either belong to an ethnic minority or who say, well, I'm part of the LGBTQ community, who almost felt in their own words to sort of like feel this need because of their identity to become active. had feelings of pressure put on them, either by themselves, but also by the groups they were basically living within. Other negative feelings about taking responsibility were a lot of hopelessness and dissolution, especially sort of like in the environmental activism, but also with regard to just general dissatisfaction with the government or with the way things are going. So things such as racism, feminism. A lot of people were quite disenchanted by how little progress was made. And then some young people talked about general social expectations and trends in activism, and were quite critical also about social media, saying that it's often sort of like something that is sparked maybe on TikTok or other social media, and people almost have sort of like this peer pressure experience of feeling they have to share certain things or they have to repost certain things, even though, as many of the participants in the focus group said, it's quite an echo chamber on social media, and the actual impact they could be making by doing these things, such as reposting content, might actually be quite limited. Going on to collective agency, I have a quote here from Adrian, who was in an environmental focus groups. By the way, all of these names are, of course, pseudonymized. I think it's really important to talk about it because I want to show that the people who are responsible for making these decisions, that people do care about what they do. And more than anything, it's about holding them accountable. You know, 10 years down the line, at least people can look back and they say, well, it's not as if you weren't told. Hopefully one day we can look back on this period and say, well, they tried to hold our leaders accountable, and people at least try to put up some resistance to all of this stuff which is happening to us. Collective agency, and I think this sort of like reflects back what we saw in this graph, comparing all the perceptions of agency, was a lot more positively coined in the focus groups as well. So it was a lot about believing in the community, believing in the collective action, believing that collective effort can actually bring change. But also a lot about it was about belonging. So one thing was about caring about other people, or caring about the planet, or caring about society, or even parts of society that are not even very close. For example, like people in the global south. It was quite strong among these participants. And there was this sort of like desire, or like almost seeking communities that maybe shared similar identity traits or shared similar values. So really the sort of like seeking communities as part of identifying with others was quite striking. And it was, regardless of the type of activism, it was there. And most people reported that they did actions in order to also make progress, not just for themselves, but for other people. And I thought that was quite interesting. And then last but not least, about institutional agency, I said earlier that there is a quite strong sense that political institutions should take up their responsibility. And so I have a quote here from Paula, who said, I think people's opinions are being heard. I just don't think they're being conveyed by the politicians. In many situations, you see politicians do these empty gestures of, oh yes, I stand with you. Oh yes, here's my performative activism. If we were to go and look at their voting record, it would say something entirely different. And I think this quote really encapsulates this kind of discrepancy between, well, yes, the politicians and the government are responsible, and young people by and large do attribute great responsibility to them. But at the same time, there's this strong sense of disappointment and dissatisfaction, especially across people in the focus groups, regardless of the topic we were talking about, even though definitely some advancement had been made regarding some of these topics. A lot of the people said it's not enough. And the general feeling was that institutions do not take up their responsibility. And that led to feelings of frustration, disappointment, dissatisfaction. I think it's important here to point out that young people in the groups were not rejecting democracy. They were very critical of the government in the UK and beyond. And also very critical, or many of them were very critical of the current electoral system in the UK. So where does this leave us with the original question of the role of perception of agency in youth activism? Moment. So personal agency. We saw that there was quite a split in the perception of whether individuals can actually do something about political and social issues. And I think maybe this is not quite clear in what I presented so far, that it's also probably dependent on the context and the topics we're talking about. But there was definitely sort of like this ambivalence that persisted within the survey, but also within the focus groups. And in the regression models, curiously, it was more strongly linked to collective activities, which I could only make sense of in that sense because people were doing things or doing activities for others. So this sort of like idea of the collective is also persistent in individual activities. So rather than displaying this direct causal effect, personal agency had a lot to do with oneself, with one's own identity, and also with one's values, and often also resulting in conflict, as we read in the quote by Frankie, who said, well, I kind of have to do something, but at the same time, I'm not even sure if I'm happy with doing something because it puts this burden onto me as a person. And yeah, as I said before, in the group discussions, the personal agency always related to other groups. And there was always this more thought about like being part of something bigger, which then relates really to the collective agency. So curiously, it was more strongly linked to individual activities. And young people just generally largely attributed positive feelings of having community, of identifying with people, mostly young people who had similar values or even similar identities, or have had a sort of like a feeling of identifying with others because they were fighting, so to speak, for the same cause. Yes, and then the last point here on the slide, identity and identification. So young people's identities are definitely important. So if we think about like more identity-based activism, people belonging actually to the LGBTQ group or people belonging to an ethnic minority, but it was less about just what makes one as a person, but more about the shared values and views. And then young people in the survey and the focus groups expressed largely negative views regarding the political institutions, and this notion of feeling unheard, feeling rejected, even though they tried to be in contact with an MP or they tried to do something, but a lot of them were underage. A lot of them, even those people that were eligible to vote at the time of the focus group, hadn't been in the general elections before, so they felt quite left out. But at the same time, young people still did attribute great responsibility to political institutions and were just critical of some actors within it or some systems or some structures within it. And also because I put out this dichotomy, or I followed this dichotomy of non-electoral and electoral actions, young people did not actually seem to be consciously differentiating between them. So instead of like seeing non-electoral participation as an instead of, I would rather describe it as an in addition to. So young people that were quite active in non-electoral activities actually were also at least intending to vote and trying to reach out to their constituency representative. So there was not like this active act of trying to like be something different or sort of like to build up a different action repertoire next to the electoral actions. And with that, I think I'll finish. Thank you very much for your attention. I just stop sharing for a moment.
Great, thank you very much, Silvia. Although I do know your work, I still find many interesting things every time I listen to you presenting your work, and clearly so many interesting findings and angles that you could go on. I have some questions that obviously I can ask them when we're meeting privately, so I'll open the floor for anyone who wants to ask anything or comments. Doesn't have to be questions.